It was a late Sunday night in Irvine, California. The date was February 2nd of year 2020. It would be on this night that a 4-alarm fire would break out at 1851 Kettering Street. The night sky would be painted gray and orange from the fiery flames, and the building was fully engulfed. The firefighters on the scene would battle throughout the night and do everything they could to save the building, but in the end, it wouldn't be enough. It would be considered a total loss. The building in question belonged to an organization that called themselves Working Wardrobes, a non-profit organization set out on helping the community. I wondered to myself, if on that night, while the firefighters were fighting the flames and the building owners were calling their insurance companies, did they ever stop to think what happened at that building years prior? I wonder if they even knew, because years before the building went up in smoke, it was the scene of a crime. A crime that would lead to a laborious investigation, and it would take years to solve. In fact, years into the investigation, the victim would still be known as a Jane Doe, someone without an identity. In due time, she would receive her identity back, but along with it, it would open up a series of new questions. And when the final pages of her story are read, you're only left wanting a sequel. This is the story of the Irvine Jane Doe. Saturday, September 5th, 2009. At around 8:30 a.m., an employee would be entering the parking lot. At the time, the building was named Pasternak Enterprises. It just so happened that on this day, the vice president of sales had come in on the weekend to catch up on some work. But when he enters the parking lot, he spots something odd. He then slows down his vehicle and he drives by what he thought to be at the time a smoldering pile of trash. But at a closer glance, he realizes that what he's looking at is a victim. So without hesitation, he contacts the authorities. When the first responders arrived, they would observe a victim laying face down, and they also observed that the victim was burned. It didn't take long for them to realize that whatever happened was foul play, so they would tape off the scene and begin their investigation. As the detectives begin to canvass the immediate area, they would come up with little to no evidence. And to further complicate the situation, the victim had no ID. Aside from the clothing that the victim was wearing, there was nothing. At that moment in time, the only thing that they could hope is that the autopsy would yield more clues. So they would transport the victim to the medical examiner's office. During the autopsy, they would come to the conclusion that the victim was a female between the ages of 13 and 26. They would find that the COD was caused by asphyxiation. With no formal identification, they would use their fingerprints in hopes of identifying the victim, but the fingerprints would lead them to nowhere. When they ran them through the database, they wouldn't come back with a match. Not knowing who the victim is makes the investigation that much harder, and they would be forced to label the victim as the Irvine, California Jane Doe. But all hope wasn't lost, because during the autopsy, they would remove foreign DNA from the victim, DNA that consisted of a Y chromosome, so they knew it was male. They would also run that through the national database without getting a hit. But although they didn't get a hit, it gave them something to hope for. And just like that, an investigation would begin, with the top priority being to identify the Jane Doe. The investigators would start by canvassing the immediate area that the victim was found in. They would start knocking door to door and questioning businesses on whether or not they saw anything. They would even collect surveillance tape. In all, they would collect over 100 hours. But after scouring through hours of footage, they found nothing. They didn't find the victim, nor did they get any closer to finding the perpetrator. They would then expand their search to the outward area. They would focus on the gas stations and any businesses along the route to Pasternak Enterprises, but it still led to nothing. At that moment in time, there was nothing left to do but to throw a Hail Mary, so that's what they do. They release a sketch of the victim. They were hoping that by releasing this sketch, it would lead to an identification. Along with the sketch, they would release a general description of the victim. The description simply read, black female, between the ages of 13 and 26. The estimated height was between 5'8" and 6'1". The approximate weight of the victim was 152 pounds. She was detailed to have short curly brown hair with brown eyes. With the picture now in the public eye, They were hoping for the best. The sketch would begin to circulate, and tips would come in. Some people thought maybe it was their long-lost relative or someone that looked familiar. But the more tips that came in, the more they had to rule out. The days after the investigation began would slowly begin to turn into weeks, and they were no closer to identifying the person. By then, the authorities had pulled the dental records, but it turns out that this person had never had dental work done. And then a change in the case. The victim that was listed between the ages of 13 and 26 would change. Upon further analysis, a dentist would say that these were teeth belonging to someone between the ages of 25 and 35. This now puts the estimated age between the ages of 13 and 35. This even further complicates the investigation. As time does, it continues to elapse, and before you know it, months had turned into a full year. And with time, the investigators become wiser. They realize that it's now time to release another sketch. Although the victim had suffered burns, the face was intact, in fact, fully recognizable. Using a post-mortem photo that would reconstruct what she looked like, this sketch was more realistic and seemed to breathe life into a photograph. And although pictures are silent, this one is screaming, "Find me. Can you see me? You see my eyes, my lips, my nose, my hair. Help me, please. Don't let me remain a statistic. I'm human. I'm more than just a victim. And although I may be mute, remember my laughter, my smile. If my pretty brown eyes were open, would you recognize them? Or would you become just as lost as I am?" Alongside of the sketch, they would release a few articles of clothing. When she was discovered, she was wearing a black camisole blouse, a black skirt. She was also yielding multicolored animal print undershorts. She was also wearing a bra, but it was burned. Alongside of the clothing, there was one distinctive piece to the puzzle. She was wearing size 10 black heels. These heels had multiple black straps, which enclosed in the front using a zipper. The detectives were able to trace these heels to a company that went by Elegant Enterprise. Turns out, they had only sold a few pair in that area, but when they checked with the retailer, they couldn't say who. With the upgraded photo being released with the articles of clothing, it would generate more leads, but like deja vu, it would lead to nothing. It was nothing but a series of dead ends. The gears of the case had begun to wind down, and then a big break. Just as they were about to break out the box labeled Cold Case in November of 2010, they would receive a hit. November 10th, 2010. Almost 14 months into the investigation, they would receive a hit on the DNA that was collected off the victim. It would come back as a positive match to then 24-year-old Zenaida Guzman. Zenaida had recently been arrested for domestic-related issues. Due to the nature of his charges, his DNA would be collected and placed in the database. But when they placed it, they received a match. This was it. The moment the investigators had been waiting for. They finally had the perpetrator. But there was one problem. Zenaida Guzman was no longer incarcerated and walking the streets as a free man. So the authorities set out to find him. It wouldn't be hard to catch up with Zenaida. He would be arrested exactly one day later at a shopping center. The day he was spotted, he happened to be with his brother, Gabino Guzman, and due to the severity of the case, they would both be hauled down to headquarters for further questioning. When the interrogation began, they would start with Zenaida. They would show him a sketch of the victim and asked if he knew the person, but he would say no. They would even show him photos of the crime scene, but he said he's never been there. Meanwhile, his brother Gabino is in a separate room, and he's also being questioned. But by the end of it, they would both deny having any knowledge. Luckily for the investigators, they had an ace in the hole, the DNA. And in a case like this, you want to go to the weak link, the one who stands to lose the most. So instead of going to Zenaida, they went to his brother, Gabino. They let Gabino know the gig is up. We have your brother Zenaida's DNA underneath the victim's fingernails. We know he did it. And if we find out that you knew he did it and didn't say anything, well, you're going down with him. With the overwhelming evidence, Gabino would break, and in order to try and save himself, he would tell the investigators everything. He says that him and his brother met the victim the night before she was found. He says that they spotted her walking on the street. They then pulled over and had a conversation. He says that she willingly got inside of the vehicle. He explains that shortly after she entered the vehicle, his brother Zenaito committed the act. When it was done, they needed a place to put her. They then remembered that they used to detail cars in the parking lot of Pasternak Enterprises, so they decided to take her there, and that's where they left her. Now, with the full confession from the brother, they go back in with Zenaito and tell him, "Look, your brother's rolled over. It's over. He told us everything, so you may as well too." And that's when Zenaito confesses. But even with a confession, there's still a problem at hand. Neither one of the brothers could identify the victim. They didn't know who she was. They didn't even get a name that night. So, one by one, Zenaito and his brother are led down to the local jail. They're handed their jumpsuits and are awaiting their trial. And then, the preliminary stages of their trial begins, and a twist comes. Both Zenaito and Gabino show up to court and plead not guilty, despite confessing. Their attorneys would even argue that the confessions should be thrown out, that after hours of questioning, they finally broke and told the investigators what they wanted to hear. The slow turning wheels of justice would be just that, and the official trial wouldn't even begin until the year of 2016. Zenaito Guzman would be first up in court. After a weeks-long trial, the jury would file out of court and begin their deliberation. The jury would go over the evidence for approximately 2 days before coming to a decision. They then all file back into court, but instead of reading the verdict, they hand the bailiff a piece of paper. The judge then reads this piece of paper, and he asks the jury, "Are you sure?" And they tell the judge, "Yes." It turns out that 11 of the 12 jurors believed he was guilty. I mean, after all, they did have DNA evidence. But despite the evidence, there was one holdout, one Hispanic juror. He wasn't buying it. He believed that the brothers were railroaded and that they were innocent. And with that being said, the judge would be forced to declare a mistrial. Needless to say, the prosecution was devastated, but they didn't give up hope. They knew right then and there they were going to retry him. They immediately refiled charges. So instead of being released, Zenaito Guzman would be held in custody, pending his new trial. The year of 2016 would come to a close, and then 2017, 2018, and then 2019. Still no further movement on their court cases, and the victim was still a Jane Doe. And then 2020. We all know what happened that year, so their cases would be delayed again. Before you know it, it was 2023, and Gabino Guzman was set for court. By then, Gabino was defeated. He no longer wanted to challenge the charges. He would show up to court and plead guilty. In exchange for his guilty plea, he would be allowed to plead guilty to second degree instead of first degree. One of the perks of this plea is that he would be sentenced to life, but eligible for parole after serving 15 years. That same year, Zenaito Guzman would also have his second trial, but this one wouldn't be like the first. At the end of the trial, he would be found guilty on all charges. Zenaito Guzman would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, but then his sentence would be changed. Zenaito's attorney would argue that the prosecution team purposely left a Mexican out of the jury. The reason for this is because they didn't want a repeat of what happened in trial 1. Turns out, the court would side with Zenaito, and they found that this was a violation. So instead of receiving life without the possibility of parole, his sentence would be changed to life with the possibility of parole. But although the brothers were now in jail and serving their time, there's still an elephant in the room. The victim was still unnamed. At the time of the trial, they had even released another sketch, a more detailed one, but it yielded no clues. It seemed to be another drawing of another face with no real background. But the investigators were still determined, and they were out to find her. November 2023. Detective Tamara Lamoureux is going through old missing persons cases as a part of her job when she comes across a case that's odd. This case is from 2009. The case in question was a runaway case. Tamara says it stood out as odd because there was no update. It was classified as a runaway but never resolved. When she went to look into bank records and home records, she found that the runaway had never updated anything. She never had a bank account, never had a job, so she would continue to dig deeper. At the time, the runaway in question would now be 29 years old, and with this person seeming to be a ghost, she suspected foul play. While investigating the case, she would run across the case of the Irvine, California Jane Doe, and the timeline seemed to match up. The runaway was reported in June of 2009, but there was a problem. This runaway was reported in Reno, Nevada, which is roughly an 8-hour drive from Irvine, California. But despite the distance, she would check in with the Irvine, California Police Department. She would send in a note and attach a photo, and when they responded, they said, "Yeah, this could possibly be her." They then contact the family of the runaway victim, and along with the Irvine, California Police Department, they would do a DNA analysis. In June of 2024, the victim would be positively identified, and the search for an identity was over. March 1995. The world would make way for Marcia Thomas. The place she called home was the state of Nevada, and she was the youngest of 5 siblings. Marcia was someone with a beautiful smile, someone who enjoyed outdoor activities, such as climbing trees. She was also athletic, playing the sport of volleyball, and when she wasn't busy with that, she enjoyed making clothes for dolls. She's described as a bright-hearted, cheery person, the type of person that if they weren't making you smile, she felt like she wasn't doing her job. She was a great student. Marcia was on the honor roll, and she had dreams of going to college. But sadly, she would never make it there, because in June of 2009, she would leave her home and never return. Her family would detail that she said she was going out to see a friend, but when she never came home, they would report her missing. When she was reported missing in Reno, Nevada, she had a history. Marcia had ran away previous times, so when they reported her missing this time, no one took it serious. She was reported as a runaway, and they kept it moving. Needless to say, she would end up a victim 8 hours away in Irvine, California. The story of what happened to Marcia Cherie Thomas is no longer a mystery, and even more heartbreaking, she passed away when she was only 14 years old. Saturday, September 5th, 2009, 24-year-old Zenaito Guzman and his brother, Gambino Guzman, were cruising the city after a night of drinking. They were riding around in their van on that night looking for female company when they spot Marcia. She's walking alone. At the time, Zenaito Guzman is in the back of the van, and his brother Gambino is driving. Gambino pulls over to the side of the road, and he chats with Marcia. Gambino explains that at the end of the conversation, Marcia agreed to get inside of the van on her own free will. Gambino says that they had come to an agreement that was mutually beneficial. Now, Marcia had agreed to get inside of the van for a lump sum of money. I don't need to go into the detail about what they were talking about because I'm sure you can put 2 and 2 together. So it's late night, or should I say the early morning hours. This is around 1 or 2 a.m. Marcia decides to get inside of the van with Gambino, but unbeknownst to her, she doesn't know that Zenaito Guzman was hiding in the back of the van. Marcia was smart. She always checked her surroundings. So when she turns around to check the back of the van, she sees Zenaito and she immediately panics. She begins to scream. She knows something is off. When Marcia begins to scream, Zenaito would pull her from the front seat into the back of the van. To make the picture more clear, Marcia Thomas was 6 feet tall, and she was also 150 pounds, and fighting back with everything she had. She was kicking, screaming, trying to alert anyone who might be in the immediate area. And that's when Zenaito begins to strike her. At that moment, adrenaline is pumping, and Marcia doesn't feel this. She's still outraged and doing everything she can to get free. So that's when Zenaido places his hands around her neck. Now that she's in a position that she's basically defenseless, under the cover of darkness, Zenaido ends it all. And while this is all transpiring, Gabino is in the front seat and he's steadily driving. He never even stops to try and help her. He never tried to stop his brother from what he was doing. He simply kept driving as if nothing was happening. Once they realized that Marcia was essentially lifeless, they needed a place to put her. So they drove her out to Irvine, California, into their secluded parking lot. They then removed Marcia from the van. She's now laying on the pavement. They then decide they need to cover their tracks. So they grab a can of gasoline. They then begin dousing the scene. And then they set it aflame. And then they drive off under the moonlight. For years to come, Marcia Thomas would be no more than a Jane Doe, an unidentified victim, tragically taken at 14 years old. I mean, this girl was a baby. As I stated in the beginning of this video, when the final pages of the book are read, you're only left wanting a sequel. And that's true, because there are a lot of unanswered questions. How did Marcia Thomas get from Reno, Nevada to Irvine, California, only being 14 and without a vehicle? When she was found wearing a black skirt, a blouse, and strap-on heels. She was lured into a vehicle under the false pretense of receiving money. And we all know what was going on in that situation, which means although Gabino and Zenaido are locked up, someone is still out there, someone who is partially responsible. Whoever had her out there walking in the dead of night. I highly doubt she chose that lifestyle on her own. There's also one more problem. When Marcia was running away in Reno, Nevada, what was she running from? A 14-year-old girl constantly running away from home is an immediate red flag. I have to be honest. I know her family members' names. I've seen their social medias. Now, I mind you, her family has been on Facebook since the year of 2009, the year that she was reported missing. I can honestly sit here and tell you today that between the year of 2009 and 2024, there's not one post looking for her, not one picture posted saying, "Have you seen me?" It's almost as if they moved on with their life and no one cared. I even spoke with someone who knew Marcia when she was younger, a childhood friend, and she explains that the family simply moved on, and if anybody ever asked about Marcia, they told them that she was somewhere strung out and didn't want to be found. Now, in the defense of the family, they claimed that they looked for her and they never stopped looking for her. But there's just no evidence of that. I mean, we have social media at hand and it's truly a powerful resource. And that's a resource none of them used. But that's no more than speculation, and it's all debatable. But one thing isn't up for debate, and that's that 14-year-old Marcia Cherie Thomas passed away alone. She then sat inside of an unmarked grave for years without an identity. And when she finally received her identity back, it was bittersweet, because although she was found, she was still lost. Lost inside of the memories of the people that truly knew her. But before all that, she was lost inside of herself. A 14-year-old girl that was unsure about life. And even with that being the case, it was tragically ended. It's truly a sad story. Rest in peace, Marcia Cherie Thomas. Thank you for being a light for others. I truly hope you receive the justice that you deserve.